From LPM,
Louisville Public Media.
Support for LPM podcasts comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.
You're listening to Where Y'all Really From. I'm Nima Kulkarni, and joining me in the studio today is Angela Singla, who worked as an OB-GYN in Louisville and is now involved in community service. Welcome, Angela.
Hi, nice to be here.
Now, we like to start each episode by asking our guests, where are you from and where are you really from?
This podcast name really resonates with me because this question was asked a lot. And I have to admit, I'd be a little cheeky sometimes because people would ask where I'm from, and I would say Louisville, Kentucky, because I was born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky. And they'd give me kind of a funny look, and then they'd be like, "No, where are you really from?" I'd say, "I'm from Louisville, Kentucky," because I didn't know any other place, really. I didn't live any other place. But then I would give it to them, and I'd say, my parents are from India. They immigrated in the 60s, and I was born and raised here in Louisville. So my dad, he immigrated in the 60s to go to school here at the Speed School in Louisville, Kentucky. He was the eldest of 11 kids.
Wow.
And his parents had really no education whatsoever. And he, on his own, decided to come and find a way to educate himself in the United States. And University of Louisville was the place that he found. So he came here. He went back to India and had an arranged marriage with my mom. And she ended up leaving her family, leaving her country, leaving her friends, and moving to a country that she'd never lived in previously with a man that she had met for 15 minutes. So, and they're still married, which is kind of amazing. So they came here, and I was born here. My brother was born here, so I can say that I'm from America, but I have Indian descendants.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's fascinating, too, in terms of our immigration history. So your parents came over in the 60s. Our family moved to Louisville from India in the 80s.
Right.
But in both of those times, so even back then in the 80s when we moved here, there wasn't a large Indian community in Louisville, right? I remember being the only Indian kid in my class. Tell me a little bit about what it was like growing up in Louisville during that time, and especially, with the background of being asked where you're from and not really being accepted as from Louisville.
Right. So at that time, there were very few Indian families in Louisville, and we all knew each other. And so we would get together on Sundays at each other's houses, and we would pray together because we had no physical space. So we would go to different places, different people's homes. We would have a prayer service or puja, and then we would share a meal together. And then as the community grew and grew, my dad actually was one of the founding members of the Hindu Temple of Kentucky because he thought it was important to have a physical space to worship.
Yeah.
And so that was really important to him, to have a place where all of the Indian families could come, get together, grow, have their kids come and have a place to learn about Hinduism, learn about their culture, and also share food, right? Because that's really important to us.
I love that. I think it's so fascinating because when we moved, the temple had already been there, right? So it had been established by people like your father and was a huge focal point in the community. So we had sort of a built-in community,
right,
or at least a place to go where we could meet other Indian families. And still, after temple, we would go to someone's house and there'd be food. So that didn't change.
Right.
That never changed. But it was really nice to have this sort of cultural touch on, like you said, a space for the community, a space to worship, but really just to meet each other and interact with each other in a very safe environment where everybody looked like you, talked like you, that kind of thing. I think it's fascinating too how our community has changed and grown because of those foundations that were built so long ago. And it's interesting to me too. So our family, my parents moved us to Louisville so my brother could attend the DePaul school. And my dad, we kind of moved right before the IT boom. So there, the waves of folks that came were like engineers and then doctors and then IT people. And so you've got this progression of reasons people came here and what they did. Do you feel like you had maybe different pressures or any pressures from your parents or from the community back then that may be a little bit different for let's say your daughter?
Yeah. So the expectation that was that you would become a doctor or an engineer, and my dad was an engineer, obviously. There weren't a lot of other professions that were in the forefront or had as much respect as those professions. Also, this was a time before the internet, and so we didn't have a lot of we didn't know of other options. I have to admit, I always kind of fought being a doctor, even though that was an expectation from my parents. My dad said, he's like, you need to be a doctor, but you can be any kind of doctor you want to be, right? There was always expectations of being top of the class, getting the best grades, but I tried a lot of different things before I actually decided I would be a doctor. When I went to college, I was a religion major, and I just did my pre-med classes kind of on the side.
That's so interesting.
Because I wanted to try different things before I decided to go into the field. I didn't want to be forced in the field. I wanted to make it my decision. So it was my decision. I think I was guided very strongly in that way, but ultimately I was the one who did it.
Yeah, absolutely. So talk a little bit about what it was like growing up in Louisville when our community was a lot smaller than it is now.
So, one of the things I love about your podcast is that we're actually talking about differences. And at that time, there was no talk about differences. It was all about assimilation. And I remember when I was growing up in Louisville, for the first 2 years of my life, I didn't speak in the house. And at that time, we didn't know this, but if you live in a bilingual household, there is delay in speech. And my parents instead got very nervous, and they decided that they would only speak to me in English instead of speaking both Hindi and English to me. And they wanted to make sure that I was as American as possible. And so that was one of the ways that they wanted me to assimilate. And that always made me sad that I lost my language when they came here. One of the other things that I remember is my parents both were vegetarian when they moved here, and they both started to eat meat when they came here because, again, they wanted to assimilate. My dad would go into business dinners, and there weren't a lot of vegetarian options at restaurants, and so he would order their meat to fit in, and also to get business deals, right? Because you didn't want to be different. Because if you were different, they might not give you the job. And so it was all about kind of putting your head down, being as American as possible. I even remember when my daughter was born, my parents helped take care of her. And I asked, will you please speak Hindi to her so that she can learn? Mm-hmm. I was like, well, if I don't know it, at least you'd know it. And my dad said no. Wow. He still has that mindset that assimilation is the best. So I love that we're talking about these differences now and that people enjoy things like Bollywood and going out to Indian food and asking me about my culture, because that was not something that happened when I was growing up.
Yeah, I think that is so fascinating. I mean, it's kind of the opposite of when I grew up, because it was really important for my dad that I talked to my grandparents who were in India, and
Yeah.
we
That's
speak
great.
Marathi.
Yeah.
And so and they don't speak English. My grandmother didn't. So these phone calls, we would have these weekly phone calls, international phone calls back
were
then, which were
expensive.
so expensive. But he made sure every week, at least once a week, we talked to them in Marathi so that they would
That's
have
great.
the opportunity. And that's the only reason I remember it now. Like, that's the only reason I can speak it now. And we had a whole episode about this on our podcast about language and how important it is to our identities, how we carry that with us, that perspective and that experience. And it's just fascinating to me that he's still, like your dad is still not okay with embracing, that part of it. And I think so did you, I mean, we have things like Hindi school now.
And I never went.
Yeah.
We didn't have it then. Hindi school was my parents'.
Yeah.
Right. And my mom would try to teach me every once in a while, and then it would get frustrating for both of us.
Mm-hmm.
And even if I try to say Hindi words in Hindi now, they make fun of me because my pronunciation is so bad. So there wasn't a lot of impetus to keep trying. I have to admit, I understand probably about 50% of what's going on. So they'll start speaking in Hindi at home, and they think I don't understand what they're saying. So, because I think it's a secret language now. But I know exactly what they're talking about, usually.
Very stealthy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was fascinating, too, the whole assimilation thing, because I was the only Indian kid in class. I'm assuming you were probably usually the only Indian kid in class.
Right.
And I remember distinctly, a few times this happened where somebody very earnestly, a classmate would say, "So do you all eat monkey brains?" Because of that Indiana Jones
Oh, the Indiana
movie.
Jones, yeah.
And it's, so this idea of you don't want to be different, you don't want to, is just because that's what people think. I mean, you don't know what people think, but this was an earnest question. This was not a person.
I totally remember that, and I remember people asking me that.
And they mean it. Like, it's not.
Yeah, and then you want to say, "Are you an idiot?" Right?
I looked upon all of those as teaching moments.
Right. I was a little older.
So tell me a little bit more about what made you decide to become an OB-GYN specifically. Why did you choose to pursue that kind of work?
So I love working with women, and I love, so for me personally, I like to see the fruits of my labor, so to speak. So I love the short-term, intense relationship you have with patients during their pregnancy. You get to know them really well. You get to know their partners really well. And then, you hopefully have a very happy outcome. It can also be a very stressful time. It can also be an unhappy outcome. And so it's very nice. It was really rewarding to me to be able to help women through those transitions. Reproductive health in general was something that I was always really interested in as well, and keeping the rights of reproductive health for women. And so I wanted to be able to practice that.
Right.
And I remember I was working as a barista once, and my boss asked me, he's like, "Well, why do you want to become a doctor?" And I said, "Well, I want to provide abortions." And he laughed at me. And I was thinking, why would you laugh at something like that? Because that's an important part of healthcare.
Yeah.
But that has always been the outside realm of reproductive health, and it's always been a kind of a taboo subject, right? Mm-hmm. And it has not been normalized either. And we take abortion and we take it outside of health, right? So even though we've politicized it, it's not really a political issue, as we all know.
Yeah,
it is a health issue. So I've always wanted to be a part of that health issue. And when I was growing up in America, you didn't see a lot of female physicians. And so I remember going back to India when I was 9 years old, and I got very sick. And I was hospitalized. And when I was in the hospital room, I saw a female physician come in. And I was just blown away because I'd never seen a female physician before. And I was like, this is amazing. And so it kind of got me thinking, well, if she can do this, then I can do this too. And she started to speak Hindi to me. And as we've talked about, I didn't speak Hindi any. So I said, I'm sorry, I don't speak Hindi. And she went immediately into English, which I thought was so cool too, that she knew 2 languages. And then unbeknownst to me, when she left the room, she took my parents out, and she started yelling at them because she said, I'm really upset with you because your daughter doesn't speak Hindi, and you need to be teaching her your culture. So regardless of that, I still thought she was amazing, and it was amazing to see an Indian woman in a position of power in India. And we also had India has had a female prime minister, and yet in the United States we still have not had a woman in the presidency. And at the time, women in the healthcare profession were just coming of age, right? And it was still a real struggle for women in medicine to be leaders. And so I think what the dichotomy between America and India is really interesting, because in India it was more about status and wealth and caste. And in America, it is very much about sex, right? And so that gave me a lot of courage to go forward and be a leader and to say, well, I can do that because I saw that. I had an example of that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That's so fascinating because we think of ourselves in America as being exceptional at everything and first
Absolutely.
at everything and best.
Yes.
And everything is equal and everybody gets a fair shot. And of course, that's not the case. And yet in countries that we dismiss as developing countries or, that has already happened.
Yes.
And that's such an interesting juxtaposition.
Yes. And, we still don't, the pay gap is still an
Right.
issue here, right? And, luckily OB-GYNs, we have, it's a pretty female-heavy profession. But, women take time off for maternity leave, and I remember at the time when I did that, I didn't get paid for half of it because why would you pay somebody if they weren't working, right? Oh, well, you took 3 months off. Well, we're going to have to delay you becoming a partner for a year because you didn't build your practice for them. So at the time, you don't think about the fact that I'm female, that I'm getting dinged. You're like, oh, well, I made that sacrifice because I wanted to be with my child. But the men aren't doing that sacrificing as well, at the same time. So they're just ways that we just kind of accept some of the discrepancies without even realizing it. And other countries do it a lot better than we do.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the date the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade on June 24th. So given your experience as a doctor, as an Indian doctor, as a female Indian doctor in Kentucky, specializing in reproductive health care, I'm really interested in your thoughts as we come up on this 1-year anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision, given how important you feel reproductive rights are in healthcare.
Yeah, it's disheartening. It's disheartening that doctors are being restricted as far as what they can provide for their patients. Patients can't find the health care that they want and need. I luckily live in a time or practiced in a time where, abortion was legal and safe. In the generation above me, when abortion was not legal and safe, we had these units of women in the hospital. They called them sepsis units, and luckily I never saw this. But they were women that would try to self-induce abortions, and so they would get very ill, and they would have to be hospitalized because of the complications that occurred. So 50 years ago, when Roe v. Wade came, the whole idea was to keep it safe, right? Because we were seeing all these women die from self-induced abortion. People have forgotten. So now, 50 years later, we're gonna. I don't know what kind of ramifications are gonna happen. I don't know what kind of things women are gonna do when they're pushed to the edge. One difference that we will see is that we now have pills that were not available 50 years ago. So I'm hoping women can have the access to that, and will prevent some of these horrible complications that we had 50 years ago. Unfortunately, the way that the court system is set up, I don't think in my lifetime I'm going to see a change. So I think it's going to be my daughter and her generation that's going to have to really fight the change, and hopefully we'll overturn it at some point.
I mean, that's so interesting. It's got to be equal parts frustrating and just probably more frustrating than anything else. You have your grandmother's generation, you have your generation where it was legal, it was accessible, it was fine, and then so we forgot, like you said, and now your daughter, it skipped a generation, so now your daughter's going to have to fight the same fight, that your grandmothers would have had to, and that's got to be something that is incredibly frustrating, because as a physician, you can only do so much, right? You can only provide the health care. You can't control the laws. You can't make the policies. And our community, and, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, isn't always very engaged politically or civically or on issues like this. They're not the ones kind of marching in the streets or advocating, in Frankfurt or in D.C. for certain issues. And certainly this is one of them. I know that when we had Amendment 2 on the ballot last November, that our community, physicians in our community, approached me with, how do we help? What can we do? Because I thought this fight was over. Right. And here it is again. And we're very frustrated and we're angry. There was a lot of anger, because there were questions. I'm a doctor. What can and can I not do for my patient who is coming to me for help? Right. And so we had an event. So we mobilized a lot of our community, and there was one event I was part of that. I mean, it was standing room only. It was, I don't even know, like over 100 people. That's great. A lot of people from our community, so physicians, but also younger generation, so med students, and they were very engaged, right, in everything and all the information, like how do we fight back, like what do we do at the polls, how do we make sure our families vote and know what is actually at stake here, instead of just sort of skipping election day because you don't like the politicians that are on the ballot. There's more at stake, this time. So I wanted to get your thoughts in terms of just even community engagement from when you grew up or were a physician and seeing this now, because even in my lifetime, I know that the engagement level has skyrocketed because all of a sudden there's a recognition that people aren't going to do it for us. Like, we're not as safe as we thought we were. And so if we don't advocate for issues that impact us, nobody else is going to kind of come in and save us. Right.
I think like my parents' generation, they just took things for granted. So we never really talked about politics or social issues. Which is probably very different from your household, I'm gathering.
Well, not growing up, right?
Okay. Well, not growing up. Right. Yeah, growing up, it was just because we were lucky enough to come to the United States. We were lucky enough to be successful. So why would we rock the boat with social issues? At that time, abortion was legal. My parents didn't really care about other factions, so to speak, because it didn't affect them. If it doesn't affect you personally, then you don't get as involved, and I think we all know that that's the power of storytelling and sharing your story, is that then people have a emotional connection. So they didn't have that emotional connection to a lot of the issues at hand. And actually, my parents and I we're divided as far as our political views are concerned. And so that's been challenging as well. Yeah. And so I feel like it might be harder for the older generation to engage. But I think my generation and younger generations are now realizing this is going to affect me.
Yeah.
Right. And wait a minute, if they're going to come after reproductive rights, then they're going to come after our gay kids. They're going to come after our trans kids. They're going to come after our mixed couples. We're going to come. They're going to come after things we just took for granted, right?
Right.
And so that's where people are like, oh my God, this could affect my family. This could affect my friends. And I think that's where you're seeing that engagement come in. And Trump, he was a real polarizing person for Indians, because he said he liked the Hindus. He liked the Indians. A lot of Indians liked him because he was a businessman.
Right.
And they thought they would have lower taxes. We were not all unified in the political spectrum. And so that was difficult. I think that was difficult for some communities, some families, including mine, to talk about those differences. Because I took things very personally. Because I was like, this affects my patients. This affects the people I see in the office. And when Trump was elected, that was a deciding point for me that I couldn't practice medicine anymore.
Wow.
I took a break from it because I was like, I can see that I won't be able to practice as effectively. I won't be able to make decisions for my patients the way that I want to. Honestly, I was just tired of fighting. I was just really tired of fighting, and I needed a break from it. And so luckily I was able to step back and do some more community engagement and get involved with more nonprofits that can help some of the root causes that affect healthcare, instead of just putting a Band-Aid on it, right? Try to help with more of the homelessness, food insecurity, getting healthcare to people, getting them insured or getting them more insurance, because we have a lot of underinsured people. So that was a big turning point for me. I think that might have been a big turning point for you as well,
was.
right?
Yes,
Yeah.
no, it absolutely was. So I had my own practice, right? Up until then, I started it in 2010. And I saw all of this rhetoric surrounding immigration. So that's who I serve in my practice, is immigrants, and mainly employment-based immigration. So it's people that are here legally,
Right.
and nobody understands what a mess our entire immigration system is. So they say come here legally, but it's almost impossible to do that. But there was a lot of rhetoric, right? And Trump made that his sort of his big issue, his signature issue, build the wall, keep them out. And he did. He, in his policies, was shutting down our immigration system. He shut down our asylum system. He shut down our consulates. If you can imagine what a mess that was. And I was hearing some of this rhetoric trickle down into Kentucky, which is far from a border state, right? We have a very small percentage of immigrants in all over our Commonwealth, maybe concentrated a little bit more in Louisville and Lexington, but certainly nowhere near the numbers you're talking about in border states or in California and New York. So this idea of a threat or an invasion that we kept hearing about, even here, was something I think that was a bit of a last straw for me. And that's what really spurred my decision to run for office. So, I became a lawyer and then an elected official, which are probably two of the least respected professions in our community. And no engineer, no doctor. But, and I told my parents, I remember I filed on the last day that it was possible to file. And I just sort of told them, hey, I'm running for office. I mean, never been involved. Like we're thankfully all on the same side of the aisle, or at least on the issues. But it's something that people view immigrants as a monolith, and they're like, well, you all think the same way.
Absolutely.
You're going to vote the same way. And nobody was talking to the communities, right?
Yeah.
Trump was.
Right.
And that's something that people forget. He really was.
Yes.
And so there's a reason why he was so successful with the South Asian community. And, and I think, that decision, I said, I can't just be a lawyer anymore. I have to do something more similar, very similar. There was a shift there in thinking in terms of mentality and what an existential threat this person posed, not just to you, but to your broader community.
Yes.
So yeah, absolutely. He changed the trajectory of my life as he did yours. And I think that's true for a lot of people. And I think we see a lot, maybe that's what spurred a lot more of the engagement that we see in our Indian community now.
Absolutely.
Even in older generations.
And then, here in Kentucky, when you see these laws being passed and it's affecting us, at a personal level, is when you're seeing people be like, wait a minute, this isn't just rhetoric anymore. Right. I mean, I'm still in touch with, my partners that I used to work with, and they have patients calling saying, where can I get my abortion? And they're like, you have to go to Illinois. And they're like, what?
Wow.
And I was like, well, we need to do we need to educate our people better too. Our people need to understand what's going on, because a lot of this is happening and people living in a bubble.
Yeah. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more from Dr. Angela Singla. This is Where Y'all Really From.
Support for LPM podcasts comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.
Your mornings are busy, and finding the time to stay up to date on what's happening in Louisville and southern Indiana isn't easy. I'm Bill Burton. Join me to stay informed on your terms each weekday with the LPM Daily News Briefing, the news you need to start your day. From Louisville Public Media. See you in the morning.
Welcome back to Where Y'all Really From. I'm Nima Kulkarni, and we're back with our guest, Dr. Angela Singla. So I know I framed it as the 1-year anniversary of the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, but in actuality, people have been chipping away at reproductive rights since Roe was handed down for the last 50 years. So talk about that a little bit in terms of how it's not something that happened all at once, and it's not quite the same fight, but it's been a fight that's taken place over the past several decades.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I was in training, I did my residency training in New York, and this was in the late 90s, and everybody was offered abortion training. That was not an issue. And that was just part of your healthcare education. And I remember coming from New York, and then I actually worked in Chicago after that at a Catholic institution. And the Catholic institution had decided there were certain things we couldn't do, and one of those was tubal ligations or sterilizations. But for some reason, we could do tubal ligations on women that were getting cesarean sections at the time of their delivery. But we had to call them uterine isolation. And this is not a medical term. This is something that the archdiocese just decided on their own. If they isolated the uterus from the rest of the body, it would protect the mother from future pregnancy and future complications. So they had rationalized us being able to do a medical procedure under religious terms.
Wow.
So at the time, I was like, well, at least I get to do this procedure for my patients. If they needed a tubal ligation outside of a cesarean section, we could do it, but we just had to do it at a different hospital. So then I moved back to Louisville, and in my career, I've worked with all three of the biggest of the big names here, and when I first moved here, we could actually do terminations for our private patients in the hospital. It just wasn't advertised. You just had to make sure that your staff was okay with it. The anesthesiologist was all right with it. The nursing was all right with it. And then at some point, the hospitals just got scared, and they didn't want to take on the liability. They didn't want to have the publicity around it. And I remember we, at one point, became affiliated with another Catholic institution that came into town. And they required, whenever we prescribed birth control, to have a medical diagnosis associated with the birth control. So that means if you got pills, you had to be on the pills because you had cramps or you had irregular bleeding, because contraception was not an appropriate diagnosis for birth control, which is actually really, again, not a medical decision that the church needs to be making.
Right.
And then one of the things I thought was so bizarre was that we couldn't put IUDs or intrauterine devices into patients in our office because they thought it was an abortifacient. So we would have to take our patients to a different office to put in IUDs. So you have to think these patients think we're crazy because we're taking them to a different place to do something that seems seemly almost. But we did these workarounds to make sure that our patients got the care that they needed. But this is the way that reproductive rights have been being chipped away slowly and quietly for the last 50 years. And we just kept doing it because we wanted to make sure our patients were being taken care of. And so it doesn't surprise me that Roe v. Wade was overturned because they have been playing the long game.
Yeah.
And the chipping away finally worked. And in order for this to be reversed, we need to do the same thing. We need to start chipping away at the rights they've taken away from us. Chipping away at what they deem appropriate, what they don't. Chipping away at, okay, it's a 6-week rule. Okay, we need to make sure it's an 8-week rule. We need to make sure that we can get exceptions for mental health, for women's physical health, for rape, for incest. We need to start chipping away at all the rights that have been taken away from our patients.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to start playing the long game. And that's where I think the younger generation is really going to have to step up. And they will step up. I've been seeing it. I've seen it with my daughter. I've seen it with her friends. They're stepping up because they realize this is going to affect them.
Yeah.
Right. It's not going to affect me as much anymore, but it is going to affect them.
But it's a question of training, and it's so interesting that you've talked about the practical impacts of, even if it was legal, right? Access to abortion was legal. Because of your employer and their religious affiliation, you had to you had to do all kinds of things, workarounds and loopholes and, semantics, so that people felt more comfortable, or on the books it looked legitimate and in keeping with somebody's faith, which you may or may not have shared, which the patient may or may not have shared, but that has directed now the course of their health care.
Right. And so, it is a clear violation of the separation of church and state. because there's an entity, a religious entity that is making choices for me and my patients based on a religion that is not theirs. That's not necessarily theirs.
Right. Or even that interpretation.
Or that interpretation.
Right.
Correct.
That is fascinating. Yeah. And it's important, I think, for people to remember that this decision is 50 years old, that, it's been overturned, but that all of these workarounds, all of these little loopholes and erosions have been going on for so long.
Yes.
And it is practitioners, kind of at the tip of the spear, deciding whether I choose to provide the health care, whether I choose not to provide the health care. I could, find this workaround so that you get the care you need, or I could choose not to. Right. And so you're at the mercy of an individual and their own sort of biases, their own, sort of personal subjective view of the world. And that is a very scary thing, and something I think a lot of people take for granted. We believe in the law. We believe in courts. We believe that ultimately the right side will prevail. And certainly no one will curtail my bodily autonomy. And it's just interesting because right now, if you're wanting to be a physician, if your daughter wants to be a physician, she's going to have to navigate legal liability to get there.
Absolutely. And then if you're a patient and you have an emergency and you're pregnant and you go to a Catholic institution, you're beholden to the rules and quote unquote ethics that they have.
Right.
So if they say that you can't terminate a pregnancy based on, their rules, you might have to transfer care to another hospital. You might not even know that that's an option for you because they're saying these are the only options that are given to you. And you can see that Catholic institutions and Catholic hospitals, as they increase their numbers, you see reproductive rights going down.
Yeah.
There have been studies on that. And that's something that mainstream media has not really grabbed a hold of.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many aspects of this that are unreported, that are just unknown, and just the consequences of some of these policies we can't even anticipate. We can't predict. Do you think Roe v. Wade, or access to abortion as a healthcare right, do you think all of that will ever be codified into law? And even if it is, do you think, given the nature of our society and how we have been doing these kinds of workarounds, do you think that will even help or result in greater access to healthcare?
Well, at this point, I think it's going to be state by state.
Yeah.
I think we're going to see states like New York, California, Illinois. You already see them codifying protections for reproductive rights. And so you're going to start seeing, or we're already seeing, another migration.
Yeah.
We're seeing people moving to places where they feel safe and where they can get the health care they want and need. And so you're going to see red states becoming redder, and you're going to see blue states becoming bluer.
Yeah. Then that's such an interesting, right?
And it's about health care. It's about health care. Right?
And it's about policy choices, right, that the state has made. So you think about people moving to this country for opportunity, for whatever reason.
Right.
But then you see what you're saying is going to be this sort of secondary migration within the country based solely on policies and freedoms that we're provided.
Yes.
That we're providing to our citizens.
Yeah.
Right.
We're already seeing that.
Yeah.
People are scared, and people are worried about staying, even in Kentucky. In Kentucky, we're seeing this. I have several people that have said, "I'm moving out. I don't feel safe here."
Wow.
And that's scary.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not what I'm not proud of our state right now.
Yeah.
I want our state to be better.
Yeah. It can be.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's in a place of limbo right now, and I think but I do think that it's up to people, and it's up to people that have not been engaged maybe before, that are going to be engaged, that we hear from a lot more, because everyone has their camps, right? You're on this side or you're on that side, and you have all these people in the middle that just have not had the opportunity or the time or the wherewithal to be involved in any particular issue, especially this one, but they're seeing their kids leave, right? They're seeing their
Right.
grandkids leave, and they don't know why. And all of a sudden,
Absolutely. Yeah.
that's personal to them
Yes.
now. So
Yeah.
that's it's going to be interesting.
That's a good point.
Well, and it's the same thing you'd mentioned, right? You come here, you're lucky because you're
Yes.
successful.
Yes.
You feel like you need to establish yourself and your family, make sure that your kids are fine, there's food on the table.
Right.
You're able to provide at least for yourself and your community. So this idea of a broader community and engagement on a civic level is just not something that is necessarily nurtured.
Correct.
As we nurture, for instance, education. Obviously
Right.
you're going to college. You're going to
Right.
get a master's. You might get 2 or 3.
Right.
You're going into a profession, right? It's a huge priority for Indian
Right.
families is education and success in whatever the field is. But this idea of being an elected official or working on policy specifically or being engaged or advocating for issues, I think is fairly new, to our community, even now.
Oh,
Even in the newer generation.
Like, why would you do that? You don't get paid for that or don't get paid well for that.
Right.
Yeah, and what is that gaining you? Because everything is about achievement.
Right.
There's a lot of achievement-based motivation in our community. So what is that, motivated? Why is that motivating to you? And I think we're both very civically minded where it's like, well, we want to help other people, right? And so I'm not going to get gain from that. And that can be a pretty foreign concept to some of our community, for sure. Not everybody, but for some.
True, but that was a pretty big step you took, right? To leave your practice and to move right into nonprofit work.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about what you're involved in and what actually, you were drawn to when you initially made that decision and why.
Well, first I needed a break, right? And then my initial thought was I was going to say yes to everything. Like, I never had time to do anything.
Like George Costanza.
Yes. So I became part of like 7 different boards, right? And my daughter was still in school, so I was very involved with the school. I was on the board of the ACLU. I was here in Kentucky. I became involved with the Educational Justice, which is a tutoring program that connects high-achieving high school students with middle school students to create mentorship and tutoring opportunities because as I've said, education has changed the trajectory of my life. So I think that's one of the key factors in changing other kids' lives too. And then over COVID, I became involved with a group called Impact 100 Louisville. We started about 4 years ago, and it's a giving group, collective women's giving group where each woman donates $1,000 and we create a $100,000 grant to give to the local nonprofit community. And in the last 4 years, we've raised about $1.5 million
That's amazing.
to give to the local nonprofit communities. And we have 5 different focus areas. And these are the ones that resonated with me when I was thinking about the root causes of health issues, and those are environment, because climate change is an issue. We have arts and education because we don't do any arts and culture. Arts and culture. We don't have arts in our schools, so that helps with so many other things like mental health and things that we're struggling with now. Obviously, education is another focus area that I've talked about. Family, so we need to do better jobs of making sure our families are getting taken care of, including housing, and then health health is another thing that we're trying to, as another focus area. So trying to find ways to help Jefferson County and the community, and doing more of a grassroots look at where we can put our money and how we can build those nonprofits, and assist them in helping people better.
Yeah. I mean, and thank you, Dr. Singla, for everything that you do in the community. As I'm sure you're well aware, there's no end to the need in our community.
That's true. That is true.
And you name some pretty broad areas that education, healthcare, civil rights. So I really appreciate your commitment to community service, and I'm hoping that your daughter will follow suit, that the next generation sees people like us and says, okay, this is an option.
Right.
You know, I've achieved whatever I need to, but even if I'm young, I can get into policy, I can get into community service, and have my own kind of impact there, right? A very direct, tangible impact on the lives of our community. So that's, I'm hoping that's something that gets instilled a little more in our families.
I hope so too. And we can lead by example.
That's right.
I mean, just like you, thank you for running for office and fighting the fight. You know, we need more people like you.
And you. Well, we'll talk about that later. So we like to end every episode with our lightning round questions. Are you ready?
Okay.
All right, here we go. What is your superpower?
Ooh, my superpower. I'm really good at logistics. I don't know if that's a superpower or not, but
we'll take it.
I'm always the party planner. I'm always the vacation planner. When I was in practice, I could kind of take a look at the office and see how it was working and figure out ways to make it run more smoothly. And I actually really enjoy it a lot. So.
That helps.
Yeah.
All right. What song do you jam out to?
Oh, gosh. I love Dancing Queen by ABBA.
What is your comfort food?
Oh, biscuits and gravy. I had a dear babysitter, Clarice, who would make biscuits and gravy for me when I was little. And my mom would try to make them. And, you know, she's not good at making, or not as adept as making American food as she is Indian food. And I never understood why her biscuits and gravy were never as good. And I realized that Clarice always used lard, you know, and that was never something that was in our pantry.
I'm so glad you didn't mention an Indian dish. When we did this in our first season, we did a lightning round amongst ourselves of me, Charlene, Dan, and May. And I said pasta was my comfort food. Yeah. And my mom will bring that up to this day that I didn't mention
an Indian dish?
My comfort food, like dal and rice or something. So I'm going to make sure she knows I'm not the only one. Biscuits and gravy and pasta. Right. That's what it is. All right.
The carb.
That's
to be a carb, right?
All right. What is the most Kentucky thing that you do?
I was going to say eat biscuits and gravy, but that...
I'll just put down the same answer.
Yeah.
Comfort food and Kentucky.
Comfort food.
All right, Angela, Dr. Singla, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Where Y'all Really From is created and produced by Dan Wu, Charlene Buckles, May Suramek, and me, Nima Kulkarni. Our executive producer is Laura Ellis. Our associate producer is Alex Biscardi. Kojin Tashiro wrote our theme song, and Leanne Gann created our logo. Where Y'all Really From is part of the Louisville Public Media Podcast Incubator, with support from the Eye Care Institute's Butchertown Clinical Trials. Our Lexington interviews are recorded at Radio Lex with engineering and assistance by Mark Royce. For more information and to keep in touch, visit whereyallreallyfrom.org.